Hey chess fans, today we're diving into the Ponziani Opening trap, a sneaky sequence that can catch your opponent off guard in just a few moves. Stick around and I'll show you exactly how to dominate the center and set up a killer attack. The game begins with pawn to e4, pawn to e5, knight to f3, and knight to c6. On your third move, you execute your plan by playing pawn to c3, preparing to push pawn to d4 and seize control of the center. This also creates a tactical threat by advancing your pawn and pressuring black's position. At this stage, your opponent usually chooses from a few standard options, which we'll examine one by one so you know exactly how to respond. Interestingly, the second most common move here is bishop to c5, echoing the Italian game. However, in this particular setup, it's a mistake because it lets you gain an extra tempo by pushing pawn to d4. This is the move you intended anyway, but now it also targets the bishop. After the exchange, black must reposition the bishop carefully. If the bishop simply retreats, you can continue advancing your pawn, forcing the knight to move as well. Often, black attempts to check your king with bishop to b4. You can easily block the check, and after almost any move by black, you start pushing your pawns, driving the knights back. This gives you solid control of the central squares, forcing the knight to retreat. At this point, you can play bishop to d3 to reinforce your dominance in the center. Now black starts worrying about your other pawn threatening the remaining knight. A common response is pawn to d6, but this falls into a powerful double attack. Queen to a4, checking the king and simultaneously threatening the bishop on the next move, a clean and highly effective tactic. Even if black sidesteps this trap, they're already in a tough position. Should they castle kingside thinking it's safe, you can proceed with your main plan, pushing your pawn forward to attack the knight. Your opponent might still feel confident, thinking they can capture the pawn on d5 due to the pin, but they overlook a brilliant sacrifice that draws the king into the open. Once the king is exposed, you unleash a strong attack using a classic attacking pattern. If the king retreats to g8, queen to h5 launches a rapid checkmating threat. If the king steps forward, it becomes extremely vulnerable, allowing you to deliver a decisive attack, possibly even with a stylish double check. Clearly, developing the bishop in this position was a mistake, giving you extra tempo to strengthen your central control. Now, let's examine the main line, knight to f6, a solid development move favored by both grandmasters and club players alike. How should you respond? You continue with pawn to d4, striking at the center and asserting your control. In most cases, black will capture the pawn with pawn takes d4. They expect you to recapture immediately, but instead, you play a crucial in-between move, pawn to e5. This advance not only attacks the knight, but also ramps up pressure across the board, creating immediate tactical threats. As you push your pawns forward, the knight is soon forced to move. Meanwhile, black may try a more subtle approach, playing queen to e7, pinning your pawn and attacking it with both the queen and the knight. At first glance, this appears promising for black, but it's actually a trap if you know how to exploit it. First, you recapture the pawn on d4, simultaneously reinforcing your pawn on e5. As black increases the pressure, taking advantage of the pin and attempting to capture your pawn, you respond with a clever counterpin using your bishop, creating tension in the center. After the exchanges, black's knight remains pinned and powerless. It cannot capture your pawn because it is still tied to the safety of their king. Black may try bishop to d7 to unpin their knight, but you respond by castling, simultaneously unpinning your own pawn and completing your development. The threat to their knight now becomes very real. Can black finally capture your central pawn as they originally intended? Surprisingly, no. Any attempt to take it leaves their queen exposed along the open file, which can quickly turn the tables in your favor. Stronger opponents may sense the danger and move their knight instead, keeping your central pawn under attack. Navigating this position carefully is essential. Yet instead of defending passively, you continue to seize the initiative, launching another offensive, this time with bishop to b5, directly targeting their queen and increasing pressure on the back rank. With accurate play, your central control remains strong, your pieces become active, and the opponent is left scrambling to defend, setting the stage for further tactical blows. Now, black plays pawn to f6, finally hoping to force you to back down, defend, or retreat your pieces. But you leave no part of your attack unfinished. You trade on f6, and instead of moving your bishop, you play rook to e1, pinning their queen and king, putting them in serious trouble. At first, black may not realize the danger and might believe that knight to e5 keeps them in the game. However, after the exchange, you deliver the final blow. Rook takes e5. At this point, your pressure becomes completely overwhelming. Black cannot capture with the pawn, as that would expose their queen, and if they take with the queen, they lose their king. In any case, moving their queen hinders their own development, making it a disastrous position. Instead, their best option is to relocate the knight to d5, trying to escape the immediate threats. At this point, black is still expecting you to recapture the pawn, but once again, you surprise them with bishop to c4, attacking their knight. The knight retreats to b6, also threatening your bishop. Now, you're at a crossroads with two possible moves. I'll show you both, so you can decide which one you prefer. One option is bishop takes pawn on f7, a high-risk, high-reward move. The other is a more conventional move, bishop to b3. We'll discuss both so you can decide which one suits your style better. Bishop takes pawn on f7 is a bit of a risky attempt, but the potential payoff is massive. You continue by delivering a check to their king, forcing them to move the king back to g8, where it feels relatively safe, almost like castling. However, there's one major flaw. Queen to b3 essentially wins the game right away. Black is forced to defend, and now the pawn becomes incredibly powerful, leading you to victory. Some might argue that if black moves their king to e8 instead of g8, Stockfish suggests that black is winning. But I would argue that, especially in blitz, this position remains very playable for white. Even though black is up a piece, if white castles and you look at the actual win rate, white wins far more games in this position. Theoretically, black is winning, but their king is exposed and has moved back and forth, which means they've effectively lost the right to castle. Now, what can black do? If they trade on c3, it helps you develop your pieces, and you already have a lead in development. If they capture the pawn on e5, it exposes their king along the open file. A natural move like pawn to h6, trying to kick your knight away from g5, fails immediately to queen to h5, which sets up a counterattack leading to a quick checkmate. That being said, while the bishop sacrifice is tempting, it's objectively not a good idea and should be avoided in serious tournament games. You play bishop to b3, putting pressure on black's central pawn. When they trade on c3, black falls behind in development, giving you more space to develop and launch an attack. Black's position becomes increasingly uncomfortable. In most cases, black plays bishop to b4, a tempting but flawed move, as they prepare to castle. They are pinning your knight, which seems like a strong move. However, after both sides castle, if you take a moment to look at the board, you'll notice that the king side is virtually abandoned. Most of black's pieces are positioned on the queen side, leaving their king highly vulnerable. This creates an opportunity for a swift attack with your knight to g5, which presents significant problems for your opponent. Theoretically, Stockfish might find a way to defend, but for a human, this is a daunting challenge. Let's say black attempts to get rid of the annoying knight with pawn to h6. You completely ignore it and instead play queen to h5, continuing the pressure. You double down on your attack, this time threatening the pawn on f7. Black will likely accept the knight sacrifice, but your attack continues relentlessly. You have multiple ways to proceed, but the simplest is bishop takes pawn on g5. Once again, you capitalize on the fact that all of black's pieces are too far from the king side, while you already have an active bishop, your queen positioned aggressively, and a knight ready to jump in and join the attack. If black tries to move their queen out of the way, you can escalate the assault with another brilliant sacrifice, bishop to f6. At this point, they are completely lost. Whether they accept the bishop sacrifice or not, it doesn't matter. You are threatening checkmate and the game is already won. Thanks for watching.